Steam locomotives have had a very rough go of things in Train Sim World. The game was first released in March 2017, but it has historically featured only diesel and electric locomotives or multiple units. It wasn't until June 2022 when we finally got steam locomotives in TSW, but they have since turned out to be incredibly disappointing for a variety of reasons. After hearing of DTG apparently deciding to indefinitely halt steam locomotive development, I decided to revisit the two steam era routes we've got in the game, and essentially just update my old reviews of said add-on packs. The two routes are called Spirit of Steam and Peak Forest. Spirit of Steam is the most ironic name I've ever seen for a Train Sim World add-on, because this thing doesn't actually capture the spirit of steam at all. Something like the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge railroad with K28, K36 and K37 locomotives would do a much better job at capturing said spirit. This add-on was released in June 2022, and I avoided buying it until I got the deluxe edition of the now obsolete Train Sim World 3. I still remember seeing the initial DLC announcement and being pissed off over the chosen time period. The way I see it, British Railways is very boring and overdone, especially on real locomotives in the preservation era, and I've noticed that, even for TS Classic, Dovetail only ever made BR era routes on the rare occasions when they actually acknowledged the existence of steam locomotives. With Spirit of Steam, you only get a linear 37-mile long route from Crewe to Liverpool, and it's set in 1958. Apparently, this particular route was made for TSW because Dovetail's outgoing CEO really wanted it, or something of that nature. It's a bit of a flimsy excuse in my opinion, almost like a top-down dictatorship. Regardless of the reasoning, Crewe to Liverpool Lime Street was still an awful route choice because of the boring and unremarkable nature of the line. The only landmark that I found interesting was the bridge over the River Mersey, just beyond Runcorn Station. The motive power options are criminally limited on this route, as it only includes two XLMS steam locomotives that were both designed by William Stanier. The locomotives in question are the 6P Jubilee Class 460 and 8F Class 280, and they look very similar to each other, aside from the different colours and wheel arrangements. The Jubilee is used on passenger services, while the 8F takes freight trains, but this leaves enormous gaps in the rail scene due to the complete lack of, for example, smaller shunting locomotives like the Fowler 3F Ginty. The ridiculously spartan rail scene, especially in the big stations at Crewe and Liverpool Lime Street, is one of many reasons why I hate this route. I think Dovetail were being too ambitious with what they tried to make as their first ever steam route in TSW. Instead, they should have started with something simple and just make a steam locomotive to run on the West Somerset Railway. There are huge yards in both Crewe and Liverpool, especially the former, and it all just looks ridiculous when these massive areas are mostly empty. Spake Junction is no better in that regard, and that's actually where I've seen the worst lag on this route, where it drops down to a pathetic 18 frames per second due to all the wagons parked in the yard. Timetable mode doesn't make the situation any better, as you've only got 99 playable services for the Jubilee and 36 for the 8F. This means that it's not just the sidings in Crewe that look like a ghost town, but the whole route does as well, especially on the section from Crewe to Weaver Junction, which is actually part of the West Coast Main Line. To summarise, I hate the Spirit of Steam DLC because of its insultingly ironic name, dull and uninteresting route choice, boring time period, wildly inconsistent frame rates, and the lack of any sufficient motive power or service variation. This was a terrible start for steam locomotives in TSW, but that's our Dovetail, I guess. And after making this video, I'm uninstalling this pathetic excuse for an add-on, because it's just as bad as New York to Trenton and the Long Island Railroad.
This isn't what I wanted!
Ah!
The Peak Forest add-on was released in May 2023, and while it's better than Spirit of Steam in some ways, this is still a disappointing pack. This time, the route is set in 1963, and we get the Ambergate to Chinley section of the former Midland Railway main line from Derby to Manchester, plus a short branch to Buxton Midland. Total route length is 38 miles, and a large section of the route featured in TSW, specifically from Matlock to Peak Forest and Buxton Midland, closed in 1967. These days, freight trains still run through Chinley and down to Tunstead Quarry, while a heritage operation called Peak Rail runs their own service from Matlock to Roseley South, the latter being a new station built in 1997. Mainline passenger trains still run to Matlock, these being the Derwent Valley Line services to and from Derby. Unfortunately, Dovetail reused the existing Jubilee and 8F in Peak Forest, along with all the passenger and freight rolling stock from Spirit of Steam to boot. The only new motive power that we got with this add-on was the Fowler 4F 060 tender engine, while the only new wagon was the ICI hopper. Timetable mode only has 29 playable services for the Jubilee, 48 for the 8F, and 27 for the 4F. You can only use the 4F to shunt wagons at Roseley, Tunstead Quarry and Go Hole sidings, or assist freight trains up the climb from Tunstead Quarry to Peak Forest. There are no services that let you drive the 4F over the full route, and this blasted thing doesn't even have a timetable mode layer on Spirit of Steam. I was confused as to why Dovetail bothered including the branch to Buxton Midland, since there are less than 10 timetable mode services covering that section, and only one of them is an arriving passenger service. Even though the timetable is more Spartan than Crewe to Liverpool, and that's really saying something, I think Peak Forest is a better route solely for the more interesting hilly terrain through which the line runs. It's just a shame that Dovetail never bothered adding the Hunslet J94 along with the Cromford and High Peak Railway, especially since they made a start by modelling the section from High Peak Junction up to the footage of Sheep Pasture Incline. I've heard of missed opportunities, but this is ridiculous. I've heard that Simtrack, the people behind that pointless payware reskin for the Class 323, are making an add-on for Peak Forest. It will feature the Class 104 diesel multiple unit, and I want to buy that pack solely for the 104, since she will add some much needed service and motive power variation to the route. Hopefully more services into and out of Buxton Midland for a start. And I don't think it's unreasonable to expect Simtrack to not screw up the Class 104. I found that the steam locomotives in TSW are annoyingly difficult to drive, especially when compared to their counterparts in Train Simulator Classic. For example, whenever I've tried driving a Jubilee 460 on a passenger run south of Chinley, she really struggles to maintain a high boiler pressure on the 1 in 90 climb through Chapel and Lefrith Central and up to Peak Forest, while she was only hauling like 4 or 5 coaches. I mean, surely a big 460 wouldn't perform anywhere near this badly in real life. I also remember struggling with the ATF280 on Spirit of Steam, and Flying Scotsman took ages to get up to even 50 or 60 miles per hour, let alone the 100 she famously achieved in the 1930s, when she was pulling a rail tour on the East Coast Main Line. In another instance, I was driving a Jubilee out of Crewe on an express run to Liverpool. As I was leaving Crewe, I tried to get the locomotive up to the line speed quickly, but instead, the locomotive absolutely bled boiler pressure and it took a fucking toad's age to only reach 42 miles per hour, let alone the speed limit of 90. I didn't really get up to any decent speed until Winsford, by which time I was only doing 77 miles per hour. You have to close the regulator and wind back the reverser in order to regain any significant amount of boiler pressure, but that means that you gradually lose speed at a time when you need as much of it as possible in order to have any hope in hell of running on time. It's an infuriating lose-lose situation. I swear that, whenever I've driven a steam locomotive in TSW, I've never seen any indication of coal and water reserves going down, and if I recall correctly, there are no opportunities in timetable mode to refuel the locomotives. Apparently, there are issues with the simulation on the steam locomotives, but I don't know what those specific issues are. Even so, I can't say I'm surprised to hear of their existence. After all, this doesn't test games we're dealing with. The physics and simulation on these locomotives are absolute crap, and it's disgraceful that Dovetail had the nerve to still go ahead and release the steam locomotives in a frustrating and unplayable state. Don't trust the promotional material for this game, especially when people like Sam's Trains and even Alan Fisher, of all people, shill for Dovetail. The situation with steam locomotives is yet another case where the silly sods from Chatham rushed something out to release for the sake of a quick buck. Here's my interpretation of the mindset I reckon DTG higher-ups have got, and I certainly wouldn't be surprised if this is actually how they think. Never mind the glaring issues that should have never made it to the supposedly finished product. Nah, stuff the players. Those people are absolute mugs who will buy anything we make. We don't have to bother putting in any real effort because we have a monopoly on train simulators. In some ways, I can understand why people wouldn't care for Spirit of Steam and Peak Forest, and consequently not buy those add-ons, seeing as an awful lot of TSW players are too young to have grown up in the days when steam locomotives ruled the roost. Indeed, I am one of those people. But at the same time, that doesn't excuse the simulation issues with the steam locomotives we've got in TSW, and I think that only adding locomotives in British Railways colours was a bad decision on Dovetail's part. That just felt like a massive cop-out, and I wonder if that was another reason why the Steam era add-ons failed. There are so many other interesting eras and routes they could have gone with, even while sticking to a British theme, instead of just making 2 Northern England routes set in the boring BR era. Here are 5 examples of pre-grouping companies that they could have included instead of boring old British Railways. Hell, they could have also done a narrow gauge route like the Festiniog Railway from Porthmadog to Blaenau Festiniog, or any Welsh route really. This line is 13.5 miles long, and it runs on 1 foot 11.5 inch or 597mm gauge track. Come to think of it, just because Spirit of Steam and Peak Forest didn't do too well, that doesn't mean people don't like steam locomotives as a whole, although that's probably what Dovetail thinks if they're only concerned about how well an add-on sells. As the Train Guy 4 said, The problem is not that people don't like them, the problem is that Dovetail did not do a good job with them. I'll include a link to his video about TSW Steam in the description. Only bothering to make 4 steam locomotives all in BR colours and 2 boring routes, then not bothering to fix the simulation issues and now putting Steam development on indefinite hiatus was a very poor show on Dovetail's part. Despite the fact that I was born long after regular steam operations ended in New Zealand, and even though I'm no expert on these things, I still enjoy seeing preserved steam locomotives in real life. And although I've found diesel and electric locomotives, or multiple units, much easier to drive in TSW than these steam locomotives, one could say that some of them are too easy to drive, especially the Class 375-9, Class 377-4, and Class 387-2 Electrostars, and I can't imagine that DTG focusing solely on simple diesels and electrics will turn out good for them in the long run. Their reputation is already well past the bottom of the Kohler super deep borehole, just when I thought that wasn't even possible, and I dare say it will be a difficult job to regain customers and repair people's trust in Dovetail games and the Train Sim World franchise.